You walk into meetings unable to tell if your boss is frustrated or just focused, missing crucial emotional cues that could make or break your career. Every day you interact with colleagues, clients, and loved ones, yet you're essentially flying, blind through the complex landscape of human emotions, wondering why conversations go wrong and relationships feel strained. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying the hidden language of human emotion, teaching millions how to read the subtle signals that reveal what people are really thinking and feeling. What I discovered about reading people's emotions will transform every relationship in your life, giving you the ability to connect authentically and respond appropriately to what others truly need. The same principles that helped me teach countless individuals to win friends and influence people can help you decode the emotional world around you with remarkable accuracy. But first, like this video, subscribe for more relationship wisdom. And comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for deeper human connection. I want to take you back to a small farm in Missouri, where a young boy with holes in his shoes first learned that emotions speak louder than words. That boy was me, and what I discovered in those early years would eventually change millions of lives, including, I hope, yours. My father was a man of few words, but his emotions filled our small farmhouse like thunder before a storm. I remember watching him come in from the fields after another failed crop, his shoulders carrying more than just the weight of physical labor. He never said he was worried about money, never mentioned the mounting debts, but I could see it in the way his jaw tightened when he thought nobody was looking. I could hear it in the heavy silence that followed my mother's questions about next month's expenses. My mother, bless her soul, had a different emotional language entirely. Where my father's worry showed in his rigidity, hers revealed itself in constant motion. She would clean the same dish 3 times when anxiety overtook her, her hands needing something to do while her mind wrestled with fears she couldn't voice. I learned to read her emotional weather by watching her hands. Calm hands meant peaceful thoughts. Busy, repetitive hands meant she was fighting some internal battle. But it was during one particularly harsh winter that I witnessed the moment that would shape my entire understanding of human nature. We had lost most of our livestock to disease, and the bank was threatening foreclosure. The tension in our house was so thick you could cut it with a knife, though no one spoke of our dire circumstances directly. I watched my parents have what appeared to be a normal conversation about the weather, but underneath their words ran an entirely different dialogue. My father's voice carried shame he couldn't admit. My mother's responses held reassurance she desperately wanted to believe. Their eyes met briefly, and in that glance I saw them communicate more than their words had said in weeks. They were both terrified, both trying to be strong for the other, both carrying burdens they felt too proud to share. That night I started keeping a diary, not of events, but of emotions. I began recording what I observed. When my father's voice got quieter, it meant he was angry, not calm. When my mother hummed while working, she was actually worried, not content. When my younger brother got especially talkative, he was nervous about something he had done wrong. I became fascinated by this hidden language that everyone spoke but no one acknowledged. I started paying attention to our neighbors, to the people at church, to everyone I encountered. I realized that most human suffering came not from what people said to each other, but from what they failed to understand about what wasn't being said. The poverty that surrounded my childhood became my greatest teacher. When you have nothing material to rely on, you learn to read people with extraordinary accuracy. You have to know when the banker is feeling generous or harsh. You have to sense when a neighbor might be willing to help, or when approaching them would be a mistake. You develop an emotional radar out of necessity. Years later, when I left that farm and entered the world of business and education, I carried with me this hard-won ability to see beneath the surface of human interaction. I discovered that whether you're dealing with millionaires or farmers, executives, or students, The same emotional truths apply. Everyone carries hidden feelings. Everyone communicates more through their emotions than their words. And everyone desperately wants to be truly understood. That young farm boy's diary became the foundation for everything I would later teach about human relations. The emotional insights born from hardship and careful observation would eventually reach millions of people through my books and courses. But it all started with learning to read the unspoken language of a struggling family in rural Missouri, where survival depended on understanding what people really meant when they said everything was fine. When I first walked into that YMCA building in New York City in 1912, I had no idea I was about to make the discovery that would revolutionize my understanding of human nature. I was just a young man from Missouri, eager to teach public speaking to help people overcome their fears. What I learned in those early classes would become the cornerstone of everything I would later teach about reading and understanding people. My first group consisted of businessmen who had signed up to improve their speaking skills. As they filed into the room that first evening, I watched each man carefully. There was Johnson, a successful insurance salesman who carried himself with confidence until he sat down. Then his shoulders hunched forward, as if trying to make himself invisible. There was Patterson, who spoke loudly and jovially with others before class, but fell silent the moment he took his seat. And there was Morrison, whose hands were already trembling before I had even introduced myself. What struck me immediately was the dramatic difference between how these men appeared in casual conversation and how they transformed when facing the prospect of formal speaking. In just those few minutes of observation, I realized I was witnessing something profound about human emotion and behavior. During our first session, I asked each man to stand and speak for just 2 minutes about their work. The transformation was remarkable and heartbreaking. Johnson, the confident insurance salesman, stood up, and immediately his face flushed red. His voice, which had been strong and clear moments before, became thin and wavering. But it wasn't just his obvious nervousness that caught my attention. It was what I saw beneath it. I watched his eyes dart to the exit door twice in the first 30 seconds. I noticed how his right hand kept reaching toward his pocket, a self-soothing gesture he was completely unaware of. Most telling of all, I saw the exact moment when his fear shifted to determination. His jaw set differently, his posture straightened almost imperceptibly, and his voice found its strength again. Patterson surprised me even more. The jovial exterior completely melted away when he stood to speak, revealing what I now recognize as deep vulnerability masquerading as bravado. His loud, confident manner had been a protective shield. When he was forced to speak authentically about his work, his voice became softer, more genuine, and infinitely more compelling than his artificial cheerfulness. Morrison taught me perhaps the most valuable lesson of all. His hands continued trembling, his voice remained shaky. But his eyes never left the faces of his listeners. Despite his obvious terror, he was completely present with the group. In that moment, I realized that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's feeling the fear and connecting anyway. His emotional authenticity created more engagement than any polished technique could have achieved. Week after week, I watched these men transform. But more importantly, I learned to read the subtle emotional shifts that preceded their breakthroughs. I began to notice that confidence returned to someone's voice about 30 seconds before it showed in their posture. I observed that genuine engagement appeared in a person's eyes before they found the right words. I discovered that the moment someone stopped performing and started truly communicating, their entire physical presence changed. The revelation hit me during our 6th session. I wasn't just teaching public speaking. I was witnessing the most intimate aspects of human emotional experience. Every person who stood to speak was revealing their deepest fears, their authentic selves, their capacity for growth and connection. And I was learning to read these emotions like a language I had been studying my entire life. I started keeping detailed notes, not about their speaking techniques, but about their emotional patterns. I documented how fear manifested differently in each person, how confidence built gradually through specific emotional stages, how authentic connection occurred when someone's guard dropped completely. That YMCA classroom became my laboratory for understanding human emotion. I realized that every interaction, whether someone is giving a speech or having a casual conversation, involves the same emotional dynamics. People are constantly revealing their true feelings through micro-expressions, body language, vocal changes, and energy shifts that most of us never consciously notice. The skills I developed reading those early students, learning to see beneath the surface, to recognize emotional authenticity, to identify the precise moment when someone's fear transforms into courage, these became the foundation for everything. I would later teach about human relations and emotional intelligence. Those businessmen thought they were learning to speak in public. In reality, they were teaching me to read the secret emotional language that governs all human interaction. That discovery at the YMCA changed not just my career, but my entire approach to understanding and connecting with people. After years of observing thousands of people in my classes, I made a discovery that fundamentally changed how I understood human communication. The words people speak account for only a tiny fraction of what they're actually communicating. The real conversation happens through emotions, and most of us are completely blind to this deeper language. Let me share with you a letter I received that perfectly illustrates this principle. A businessman named Robert wrote to me about how learning to read emotions saved his marriage. He had been coming home every evening, asking his wife how her day went. She would always answer, "Fine," with a smile. For months he took her at face value. Their conversations were pleasant but increasingly superficial, and he couldn't understand why their relationship felt distant. Then Robert began applying what he had learned in my class about reading emotional undertones. He started paying attention not just to his wife's words, but to how she said them. He noticed that when she said "fine" on certain days, her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Her shoulders carried a slight tension. Her voice had a brittle quality. That spoke of barely contained stress. Instead of accepting her words at face value, Robert began responding to what her emotions were actually telling him. "It sounds like you've had a challenging day. Would you like to talk about it?" The first time he said this, his wife broke down crying. She had been struggling with difficulties at work for months, feeling unable to burden him with her problems. Because he seemed satisfied with her surface answers, this is the power of emotional reading that I want you to understand. Robert's wife wasn't lying when she said, "fine." She was communicating on two levels simultaneously. Her words were protecting both of them from immediate conflict, while her emotions were desperately hoping someone would see through to her. Real experience. I've observed this pattern countless times in my classes and personal interactions. A businessman says he's confident about a presentation while his hands shake slightly. A student claims to understand the material while her eyes show confusion and frustration. A husband says he's not angry while his jaw remains clenched and his voice carries an edge that could cut glass. The research that would later emerge confirmed what I had observed for decades. The actual words we speak carry only about 7% of our total communication. 38% comes through our tone of voice and 55% through our body language and facial expressions. But I learned something even more important than these statistics. Emotions are the driving force behind all of these. Non-verbal signals. When someone is genuinely happy, their entire being radiates that emotion. Their voice has warmth, their posture opens up. Their facial expressions become animated and authentic. When someone is worried, that anxiety seeps into every aspect of their communication, regardless of what words they choose to speak. I remember a particular incident that drove this point home for me. During one of my corporate training sessions, a department manager insisted that his team had excellent morale and communication. His words were convincing, his statistics were impressive, but something in his emotional presentation troubled me. His smile appeared forced, his gestures seemed rehearsed, and most telling of all, his eyes kept darting toward his team members, as if checking their reactions. After the session, I spoke privately with several team members. The reality was entirely different from what their manager had presented. Morale was low, communication was strained, and the team felt their concerns were being dismissed. The manager's emotional signals had told the true story, even as his words painted a false picture. This experience taught me that emotions don't lie, even when people want them to. Fear shows up in micro-expressions that flash across someone's face for just fractions of a second. Anger leaks through vocal tension, even when someone is trying to sound calm. Joy radiates through authentic body language that can't be manufactured. The cost of emotional blindness in both personal and professional relationships is enormous. Marriages fail because partners respond only to words while ignoring emotional pleas for connection. Business deals collapse because negotiators miss the emotional signals that reveal true interests and concerns. Friendships deteriorate because people take surface conversations at face value while underlying feelings build up like pressure in a steam engine. But when you learn to read emotions accurately, everything changes. You begin responding to what people actually need rather than just what they're saying they need. You catch problems while they're still manageable instead of waiting until they explode. You build deeper trust because people feel truly seen and understood. The foundation of all effective human relations rests on this simple but profound truth. People are always communicating their emotions, whether they intend to or not. Those who learn to read this emotional language gain access to a deeper level of human connection and understanding that transforms every relationship in their lives. If you want to master the art of reading people's emotions, you must start with the eyes. In my decades of studying human behavior, I have learned that the eyes reveal more authentic emotion in a single glance than most people communicate in entire conversations. Let me teach you how to decode this most revealing of all emotional languages. I began systematically studying eyes during my early teaching years, when I noticed that my most successful students had one thing in common: they could maintain genuine eye contact even when nervous. But it wasn't just their ability to look at people that made them effective. It was their capacity to see what others were really feeling through their eyes. The first principle I discovered is the difference between looking and seeing. Most people look at eyes but don't really see them. They're so focused on what they want to say next, or so uncomfortable with intimacy, that they miss the wealth of emotional information constantly being transmitted through eye contact. Let me share what I learned to observe. When someone is genuinely interested in what you're saying, their pupils dilate slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to notice if you're paying attention. This isn't something people can control consciously. It's an automatic response that reveals authentic engagement. I've used this knowledge countless times in business negotiations and personal conversations to gauge whether my message is truly landing. Conversely, when someone is bored or distracted, their eyes take on a glazed quality. The focus becomes slightly unfocused, even if they're looking directly at you. I learned to recognize this look during my lectures and would immediately change my approach when I saw it appearing across multiple faces in my audience. The direction of someone's gaze tells you enormous amounts about their emotional state. When people are accessing memories, their eyes typically move in one direction. When they're constructing or imagining something, they move differently. But more importantly, for emotional reading, when someone is feeling shame or guilt, they instinctively look down and away. When they're feeling defensive or angry, their gaze becomes more direct and intense, often accompanied by a slight narrowing of the eyes. I discovered something fascinating about smiles through careful observation of eyes. A genuine smile, what researchers would later call a Duchenne smile, engages the muscles around the eyes, creating small wrinkles or crow's feet. A forced or polite smile uses only the mouth muscles, leaving the eyes unchanged. Once you learn to see this difference, you can instantly distinguish between authentic happiness and social politeness. During one of my corporate training sessions, I was working with a sales team that was struggling with client relationships. I taught them to watch their clients' eyes during presentations. Within weeks, their success rate improved dramatically. They learned to recognize when a client's eyes showed genuine interest versus polite attention. They could see confusion or concern in someone's eyes long before it was voiced, allowing them to address issues immediately rather than losing the sale. One of the most powerful eye-reading skills I developed was detecting emotional authenticity during difficult conversations. When someone is telling the truth about their feelings, their eyes remain steady and present. When they're hiding something or being dishonest about their emotional state, their eyes show micro-movements, quick glances away, excessive blinking, or a subtle shift in focus that suggests internal conflict. I remember counseling a young couple whose marriage was in crisis. The husband insisted he wasn't angry about his wife's career demands, but his eyes told a different story. Every time the topic came up, his eyes would flash with irritation for just a split second before he composed his expression. His wife had been responding to his words, "I support your career," while missing the emotional truth his eyes were broadcasting. "I feel neglected and resentful." Once I taught them both to read these eye signals. They could address the real emotional issues instead of dancing around them with polite words that masked their true feelings. The eyes also reveal what I call emotional leakage, moments when someone's carefully controlled expression slips and their authentic feeling shows through. These moments usually last only fractions of a second, but they're incredibly revealing. A flash of hurt in someone's eyes when they claim to be fine. A moment of fear when they insist they're confident. A glimpse of excitement when they're trying to appear neutral. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that the eyes reveal not just what someone is feeling, but how deeply they're feeling it. Surface emotions create surface changes in the eyes. Deep emotions, love, grief, profound joy, genuine fear, create changes that involve the entire eye area and can't be faked or hidden. The key to reading emotions through eyes is practice and patience. Start by observing people you know well in comfortable settings. Notice how their eyes change when they're truly happy versus just being polite. Watch how their gaze shifts when they're thinking versus when they're feeling. Pay attention to the subtle differences between eyes that are engaged and eyes that are merely present. Master this skill, and you'll find yourself connecting with people at a level most never experience. You'll see through surface politeness to genuine emotion. You'll catch problems before they become crises. Most importantly, you'll respond to what people are actually feeling rather than just what they're saying they feel. The human voice carries emotions like a river carries silt, sometimes visibly, sometimes hidden beneath the surface, but always present. During my years in radio and public speaking, I learned that the voice reveals emotional truths that even the speaker doesn't realize they're broadcasting. Let me teach you to hear what others miss in every conversation. My education in vocals. Emotion began unexpectedly during my brief stint in radio work. Sitting behind a microphone, speaking to an invisible audience, I had to convey emotion using only my voice. But more importantly, I learned to hear the subtle emotional variations in other voices, announcers, guests, callers, with crystal clarity. Without the distraction of visual cues, the voice reveals its secrets more readily. The first principle I discovered is that emotional tension always affects vocal production. When someone is stressed, anxious, or upset, their throat muscles tighten involuntarily. This creates a higher pitch than their natural speaking voice. I've observed this countless times in business meetings, executives trying to sound confident, while their voice betrays their nervousness, By climbing half an octave higher than their normal tone, pace reveals more about emotional state than most people realize. When someone is excited or nervous, they tend to speak faster, often rushing through their words as if afraid they won't be heard or understood. Conversely, when someone is depressed, uncertain, or trying to hide something, their speech slows down. They're buying time to think, or they lack the emotional energy for normal conversational rhythm. I learned to pay particular attention to volume variations within someone's speech. A person who starts strong, but whose voice gradually gets quieter, is losing confidence in what they're saying. Someone whose voice suddenly drops in volume when discussing certain topics is likely feeling shame or discomfort about those subjects. And those who speak consistently louder than necessary are often compensating for feeling powerless or unheard. During one of my seminars, I was working with a manager who claimed his team respected his leadership. As he described his management style, I noticed something curious about his vocal patterns. When he talked about giving direction to his team, his voice became more forceful and authoritative. But when he mentioned receiving feedback from his employees, his voice softened and sped up slightly. Subtle signs of discomfort and insecurity. After the session, I learned that his team actually found him intimidating and unapproachable. His aggressive vocal tone when discussing authority revealed his own uncertainty about his leadership position. He was overcompensating with volume and intensity because he didn't feel secure in his role. The emotional undertones in someone's voice often contradict their words entirely. I've heard people say "I'm fine" in voices that carried clear notes of sadness, frustration, or exhaustion. The words lie, but the voice tells the truth. A person might say they're excited about a new opportunity while their voice lacks any genuine enthusiasm, flat, monotone, going through the motions of appropriate response while their emotions remain disengaged. Vocal authenticity has a particular quality that's unmistakable once you learn to recognize it. When someone speaks from genuine emotion, their voice has richness and variation. It rises and falls naturally, speeds up and slows down in response to their feelings. Manufactured or false emotion creates vocal patterns that are too controlled, too consistent, lacking the natural variations that accompany authentic feeling. I discovered that certain emotions create distinctive vocal signatures. Genuine anger makes the voice sharper and more focused, often accompanied by precise articulation as the person tries to maintain control. Fear makes the voice smaller and less resonant, as if the person is trying to take up less space. Sadness removes energy from the voice, making it sound hollow or empty. But joy, authentic joy, does something magical to the voice. It adds warmth and resonance that can't be faked. The voice becomes more musical, more alive. You can hear someone smile in their voice before you see it on their face. One of the most valuable skills I developed was detecting sincerity through vocal patterns. When someone is being genuinely honest, their voice remains consistent with their emotional state. When they're being deceptive or hiding their true feelings, you can hear the internal conflict in their voice, slight hesitations, unnatural emphasis on certain words, or a disconnect between their emotional tone and their content. I taught this skill to salespeople who needed to build trust with clients, to managers who wanted to improve team communication, and to couples who were struggling to understand each other's real feelings. In every case, learning to hear the emotions behind the words transformed their relationships. The key to developing this skill is active listening, not just hearing words, but paying conscious attention to how those words are delivered. Practice with people you know well first. Notice how their voice changes when they're tired versus energetic, when they're genuinely pleased versus just being polite, when they're certain about something versus when they're guessing. Start conversations focused entirely on vocal emotion, rather than content. You'll be amazed at how much more you understand about what people are really feeling and thinking. The voice never lies about emotion. It simply requires someone skilled enough to hear its truth. The human body speaks a language more ancient and honest than words. Throughout my career, I've photographed and studied thousands of people during my training sessions, and I've learned that the body never lies about emotion. Every feeling, every attitude, every genuine reaction shows up in posture, gesture, and movement long before it reaches conscious expression. My fascination with body language began during my early corporate training days when I noticed a peculiar pattern. The executives who claimed to have the most confidence often displayed the most defensive body language. They would cross their arms while talking about their leadership skills, or lean away from the group while insisting they welcomed collaboration. Their bodies were broadcasting the opposite of their words. Posture tells the story of someone's emotional relationship to their environment. When a person feels confident and secure, their posture naturally opens up. Their shoulders settle back. Their chest expands slightly, and they take up their natural space without apology. They stand or sit as if they have every right to be exactly where they are. Defensive posture creates the opposite effect. Arms cross over the chest, shoulders hunch forward, creating a protective barrier, and the person seems to shrink into themselves. I've observed this transformation happen in real time during difficult conversations, watching someone's confident posture gradually close down as they feel increasingly threatened or uncomfortable. During one memorable training session, I was working with a sales team that was struggling with client presentations. I noticed that their most effective salesperson had a unique quality. Her posture remained consistently open and relaxed, even when clients asked challenging questions. Her body language signaled calm confidence, which put clients at ease and made them more receptive to her message. In contrast, her colleagues would unconsciously mirror their clients' defensive postures. When a client crossed their arms skeptically, the salespeople would respond by crossing their own arms. When clients leaned back in rejection, the salespeople would lean forward aggressively, creating an unconscious power struggle that killed the sale before it began. This taught me about the power of unconscious mirroring, one of the most fascinating aspects of body language. When people feel genuinely connected, they naturally begin to mirror each other's movements and postures. Legs cross in the same direction, arms move similarly, heads tilt at matching angles. This synchronization happens completely below conscious awareness and indicates authentic rapport, but forced mirroring feels artificial and manipulative. I've seen people try to use mirroring as a technique, consciously copying another person's movements. The result always feels stilted and false, because it lacks the emotional authenticity that drives natural synchronization. Hand gestures reveal enormous amounts about emotional state and authenticity. When someone speaks from genuine conviction, their hands move naturally to support their words. The gestures flow from their emotional energy and help express what they're feeling. Nervous or deceptive speakers often have disconnected hand movements, gestures that don't match their words or emotions, creating a sense of incongruence that listeners pick up unconsciously. I learned to pay special attention to what people do with their hands when they're not actively gesturing. Confident people let their hands rest naturally. Anxious people engage in self-soothing behaviors, touching their face, playing with jewelry, adjusting their clothing. Defensive people often clench their hands or hold them rigidly. Personal space usage provides another window into emotional state. People who feel secure and comfortable naturally claim their appropriate space. They don't shrink away or try to make themselves smaller. People who feel intimidated or insecure unconsciously minimize their physical presence, taking up less space than they're entitled to. Conversely, aggressive or compensating individuals often claim more space than appropriate, spreading their belongings, sitting with legs wide apart, or standing closer to others than social norms suggest. This space expansion usually indicates either genuine dominance or overcompensation for feeling powerless. I discovered that the most revealing body language happens in moments of transition, when someone is moving from one emotional state to another. During my seminars, I learned to watch participants during breaks and before sessions began. Their unguarded body language during these informal moments often revealed their true feelings about the training, their colleagues, and their own confidence levels. One particular insight changed how I understood workplace dynamics entirely. I noticed that in meetings, the person everyone unconsciously oriented toward, whose direction others faced, whose movements others subtly mirrored, was rarely the person with the highest title. True influence and leadership showed up in body language patterns that had nothing to do with organizational charts. The most powerful body language skill I developed was learning to read emotional congruence when someone's words, voice, and body language all told the same story. When all three channels aligned, I knew I was hearing authentic communication. When they conflicted, I knew to pay attention to what the body was saying rather than what the words claimed. Reading body language accurately requires understanding cultural context and individual baselines. What signals confidence in one culture might indicate rudeness in another. More importantly, you need to establish how someone normally carries themselves before you can interpret changes in their body language. The secret to mastering body language. Reading is to observe patterns rather than isolated gestures. A single crossed arm might just mean someone is cold, but crossed arms combined with backward lean, tightened facial expression and minimal eye contact tells a clear story of emotional withdrawal. When you learn to read this silent conversation, you gain access to people's authentic emotional experience, rather than just their carefully constructed verbal presentations. You can respond to what they're really feeling, address concerns before they're voiced, and build connections based on genuine understanding rather than surface communication. In all my years of studying human emotion, nothing fascinated me more than discovering the fleeting facial expressions that flash across people's faces for mere fractions of a second. These micro-expressions, as I came to call them, reveal authentic emotions before the conscious mind has time to control or disguise them. Learning to catch these brief moments revolutionized my ability to understand what people truly feel. My journey into micro-expressions began with my sketch pad during my training sessions. I started drawing facial expressions as a way to remember and analyze what I was observing. What struck me was how often I would capture expressions in my drawings that seemed different from what I remembered seeing during the actual interaction. Looking back at my sketches, I realized I was documenting brief emotional displays that appeared and disappeared so quickly that conscious observation barely registered them. I discovered that there are 7 universal emotions that show up in facial expressions across all cultures: happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, disgust, and contempt. Regardless of someone's background, these emotions create the same facial muscle movements. But here's what most people miss. These authentic expressions appear first as lightning-quick flashes before being replaced by socially appropriate expressions. Let me illustrate with a story from one of my corporate seminars. I was working with a department head who insisted that his relationship with his supervisor was excellent. Throughout our conversation, he spoke positively about his boss's leadership and their collaboration. But I kept seeing something in his face that didn't match his words. Every time he mentioned his supervisor's name, a micro-expression of disgust flashed across his face. His nose wrinkled slightly, his upper lip raised almost imperceptibly, and his eyes narrowed for just an instant before returning to his pleasant, professional expression. The entire sequence lasted less than half a second, but it told the real story of his feelings. When I gently explored this observation with him, he initially denied any negative feelings, but as we talked further, the truth emerged. His supervisor had recently taken credit for his work on a major project. He was furious, but felt powerless to address it directly. So he was trying to maintain a positive attitude consciously, while his authentic emotions leaked through in micro-expressions Fear has its own distinctive micro-expression signature. The eyebrows raise and draw together, the upper eyelid raises, exposing more of the white of the eye, and the lips stretch horizontally. I learned to recognize this pattern in job interviews, performance reviews, and difficult conversations. People might claim they feel confident about a situation, but their micro-expressions of fear reveal their authentic emotional state. Anger micro-expressions are particularly revealing because anger is often the emotion people work hardest to control in professional and social settings. The eyebrows lower and draw together, the upper eyelid raises, the lower eyelid raises, and the lips press together tightly. These changes happen automatically when anger is triggered, before the person has time to compose their expression into something more socially acceptable. During one of my marriage counseling sessions, I was working with a couple who claimed they never fought. The wife insisted that conflict wasn't an issue in their relationship, but every time her husband spoke about their financial decisions, micro-expressions of anger flickered across her face. These brief flashes revealed that she was actually furious about money issues, but was suppressing her feelings to maintain peace. Once I taught her to recognize these feelings in herself and helped her husband see the micro-expressions. They could address the real emotional issues instead of pretending everything was fine while resentment built beneath the surface. Surprise micro-expressions are unique because they're almost impossible to fake convincingly. True surprise raises the eyebrows, widens the eyes, and opens the mouth. But here's the key. Genuine surprise lasts only about half a second. If someone holds a surprised expression longer than that, they're likely performing surprise rather than feeling it. I used this knowledge extensively in business negotiations. When I presented an offer or proposal, I could gauge authentic reactions by watching for genuine surprise micro-expressions versus performed ones. This helped me understand whether someone was truly considering my proposal or just being polite. The most challenging micro-expressions to detect are contempt and disgust because they're often subtle and brief. Contempt appears as a slight raising of one corner of the mouth, not a smile, but a unilateral lip raise that signals feelings of superiority or disdain. Disgust shows up as a wrinkled nose and raised upper lip, often accompanied by a slight turning away of the head. These emotions are particularly important to recognize because they signal relationship damage. When someone feels contempt or disgust toward another person, the relationship is in serious trouble, even if surface interactions remain polite. The key to developing micro-expression reading skills is practicing what I call emotional snapshot observation. Instead of looking at someone's face as a whole, learn to take mental snapshots of their expressions during emotional moments. Train your eye to catch the initial expression before it's replaced by the controlled one. Start with people. During low-stakes conversations. Notice the micro-expressions that appear when they talk about different topics: work, family, future plans, past experiences. Pay attention to the brief flashes of authentic emotion that precede their composed responses. Most importantly, remember that micro-expressions reveal what someone is feeling in the moment, not necessarily how they feel overall about a situation. A flash of anger doesn't mean someone is an angry person. It means something triggered that emotion briefly. Use this information to understand and respond to people's authentic emotional experience rather than just their words. When you master the art of reading micro-expressions, you gain access to people's unfiltered emotional truth. You can respond with empathy to feelings they might not even realize they're experiencing, and you can address emotional issues before they escalate into larger problems. The most challenging and rewarding application of emotional reading comes when working with groups. I learned this during the largest corporate seminar I ever conducted, a room filled with over 2,000 executives from across the country. What I discovered that day about group emotional dynamics changed how I approached every subsequent gathering, from small team meetings to massive auditoriums. Individual emotions are complex enough, but when you put people together, something remarkable happens. Emotions become contagious, spreading through groups like ripples across water. Understanding this phenomenon is crucial for anyone who wants to influence, lead, or simply navigate group settings effectively. As I stood before those 2,000 executives, I could feel the emotional temperature of the room as clearly as if someone had handed me a thermometer. There was excitement, yes, but underneath it ran currents of skepticism, fatigue, and in some corners, outright resistance. The fascinating part was watching how these emotions moved through the crowd in visible waves. I learned to identify what I call the emotional leaders in any group. Not necessarily the people with titles or formal authority, but those whose emotional state influenced everyone around them. In that massive seminar, I spotted several of these individuals within the first few minutes. When one particularly charismatic executive near the front leaned forward with genuine interest, I watched that engagement spread to the people around him like a slow-motion wave. But even more instructive was observing the negative emotional leaders. In the back left section sat a senior manager whose body language screamed skepticism, arms crossed, slight backward lean, facial expression set in what I recognized as polite but dismissive attention. What amazed me was watching his emotional state infect the entire section around him. People who had entered the room with open curiosity gradually adopted similar defensive postures simply by being in his emotional field. This taught me one of the most important principles of group emotional reading. Emotions spread unconsciously through proximity and influence. People absorb the emotional states of those around them, often without realizing it's happening. A single highly emotional person can shift the entire energy of a group within minutes. During smaller corporate training sessions, I developed techniques for reading group emotional consensus. I learned to scan faces systematically, looking for what I called emotional clustering, when multiple people showed similar expressions or energy levels. When I saw widespread nodding, forward-leaning, and engaged eye contact, I knew the group was with me. When I noticed multiple people checking watches, shifting in seats, or making brief eye contact with each other, I knew I was losing them. But the most valuable skill I developed was distinguishing between surface compliance and genuine engagement. A group might appear attentive, sitting quietly, looking in my direction, while being emotionally checked out. I learned to read the subtle signs of authentic engagement, the quality of attention in people's eyes, the natural variations in their posture as they responded to different ideas, the spontaneous micro-expressions that showed they were genuinely processing information rather than just being polite. One particular session taught me about reading group tension and resistance. I was working with a management team that was implementing major organizational changes. On the surface, everyone was cooperative and professional, but the emotional undercurrents told a different story entirely. I could see the real alliances and conflicts through subtle body language patterns. People aligned with the changes sat slightly forward and made more eye contact with leadership. Those opposed leaned back and made more frequent eye contact with each other. Silent communications of shared resistance. Most revealing were the moments between formal discussions when people thought they weren't being observed. The group's true emotional map revealed itself in who gravitated toward whom during breaks. Reading emotional energy in groups also means understanding how excitement builds and spreads. Genuine enthusiasm has a particular quality. It's infectious and energizing. People's posture opens up, their voices become more animated, and their gestures become more expansive. But manufactured enthusiasm feels hollow and fails to spread naturally through a group. I learned to gauge group emotional momentum by watching energy levels throughout a session. When a group is genuinely engaged, their energy tends to build over time. People become more animated, more willing to participate, more connected to each other. When a group is going through the motions, energy gradually depletes, and people become more withdrawn and formal. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered how to read the emotional relationship between leaders and their groups. True leadership creates a particular kind of emotional resonance. People naturally orient toward the leader, mirror their energy to some degree, and show signs of genuine respect and engagement. Authoritarian leadership creates different patterns, compliance mixed with subtle signs of resentment or fear. The key to reading group emotions effectively is learning to see the forest as well as the trees. Yes, observe individual reactions, but also step back and sense the overall emotional climate. Notice how emotions flow through the group, where they originate, and how they transform as they spread. Pay attention to the informal emotional influencers. They're often more powerful than the official leaders in determining group mood and engagement. Watch for emotional clustering and be alert to shifts in group energy that signal changing attitudes or emerging resistance. Most importantly, remember that groups amplify emotions. A small amount of genuine enthusiasm can energize an entire room. But negative emotions, fear, anger, skepticism, can also spread quickly and poison group dynamics. Understanding these patterns allows you to respond appropriately to what the group is actually feeling, rather than what they're saying or what you hope they're feeling. When you master group emotional reading, you can navigate complex group dynamics with confidence, address resistance before it becomes destructive, and build the kind of authentic engagement that transforms both individuals and organizations. Timing in human relations is everything, and learning to read emotional readiness transformed my ability to connect with people at the deepest level. Over the years, I've kept detailed appointment calendars, not just for scheduling, but for noting the optimal emotional timing for different types of conversations. What I discovered is that approaching someone at the wrong emotional moment can destroy even the most well-intentioned communication. The foundation of emotional timing lies in recognizing that every person moves through predictable emotional rhythms throughout their day, week, and even seasons of their life. Just as there are physical rhythms, times when we're energetic or tired, there are emotional rhythms that determine when someone is receptive to different kinds of interaction. I learned this lesson dramatically during my early consulting work with a manufacturing company. The plant manager was known for being difficult and unapproachable, but I needed his cooperation for a major training initiative. After observing him for several days, I noticed a pattern. Every morning, he would arrive tense and irritated, spending the first hour dealing with overnight problems and production issues. But around 10:30, after he'd resolved the immediate crises, his emotional state would shift. His shoulders would relax, his voice would lose its edge, and he would actually initiate friendly conversations with his staff. I timed my approach for this window of emotional receptivity. Instead of trying to discuss the training program during his stressed morning hours, I waited until his natural rhythm created openness. The conversation that had been impossible at 8:30 became productive and collaborative at 10:45. The difference wasn't in what I said, but in when I said it. This taught me to identify what I call emotional green lights, moments when someone is psychologically ready to engage with new ideas, difficult topics, or important requests. These moments are characterized by relaxed body language, natural voice tones, and a general sense of presence rather than distraction. Conversely, I learned to recognize emotional red lights, times when approaching someone with anything significant would be counterproductive. Signs include physical tension, rapid speech, distracted attention, or what I came to recognize as emotional overload, that glazed look that means someone's psychological circuits are already maxed out. One of the most important timing principles I discovered relates to criticism and praise. People can only absorb feedback when they're in an emotionally receptive state. I've seen well-meaning managers destroy relationships by delivering necessary criticism when their employees were already stressed, or overwhelmed. The feedback, no matter how valid, gets processed as attack rather than help. I developed a practice of reading someone's emotional state before any important conversation. Are they centered and present, or scattered and reactive? Are they feeling confident and secure, or vulnerable and defensive? The same message delivered during emotional security lands completely differently than when someone is feeling fragile. During my marriage counseling work, I saw countless couples who had perfect communication skills but terrible timing. They would try to resolve conflicts when both partners were emotionally activated, ensuring that even reasonable discussions would escalate into arguments. I taught them to recognize when their partner was emotionally available for difficult conversations versus when they needed space to process or decompress. The art of emotional timing also involves recognizing momentum, those moments when someone is ready for change, growth, or new challenges. I learned to identify what I call breakthrough readiness, when someone has reached a point of openness to transformation that might not be available again for months. This happened frequently in my training sessions. Most participants would arrive with a certain level of resistance or skepticism, but somewhere during the program, usually in response to a particular exercise or insight, their emotional state would shift dramatically. Suddenly, they would be ready to examine beliefs, try new approaches, or commit to changes they had been resisting. Learning to recognize and act on these moments of readiness made the difference between temporary inspiration and lasting transformation. I also discovered the importance of emotional recovery time. People have limited emotional bandwidth, and pushing for continued engagement when someone has reached their emotional capacity creates resistance and fatigue. Just as athletes need physical recovery time, people need emotional recovery time between intense conversations or challenging interactions. This knowledge proved invaluable in my corporate training work. Instead of scheduling back-to-back intensive sessions, I learned to build in emotional recovery time, periods for reflection, casual conversation, or simply mental rest. Participants who might have become overwhelmed or resistant with continuous pressure remained engaged and open throughout. Longer programs, one of the most sophisticated timing skills I developed, was reading someone's emotional trajectory, not just their current state, but the direction their emotions were heading. Someone might appear calm in the moment, but show subtle signs that stress is building. Catching this early trajectory allowed me to adjust my approach before their emotional state shifted to resistance or overload. I learned to recognize the signs of emotional fatigue before it became obvious. Slightly slower responses, decreased animation in gestures, less variation in vocal tone, all indicators that someone's emotional resources were depleting even if they hadn't consciously recognized it themselves. The practical application of emotional timing extends to every area of life. Sales professionals who master this skill approach clients when they're psychologically ready to make decisions rather than when it's convenient for the salesperson's schedule. Parents learn to have important conversations with their children during moments of natural openness rather than forcing discussions during resistant periods. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that respect for emotional timing builds trust in ways that nothing else can. When you consistently approach people during their moments of readiness and give them space during their times of depletion, they begin to feel understood and honored at a deep level. The key to mastering emotional timing is patient observation combined with responsive flexibility. Watch for the natural rhythms in people's emotional availability. Notice the patterns when they're most receptive, when they need space, when they're ready for challenges versus when they need support. Most people are emotionally available for different types of conversation at different times. Someone might be ready for creative brainstorming in the morning, but need routine, low-stress interactions in the afternoon. Another person might be most open to personal conversations late in the day, but resistant to the same topics during busy midday hours. Learn to read not just what someone is feeling, but whether they have the emotional capacity for what you need. To discuss, sometimes the most caring thing you can do is wait. Sometimes the most effective thing you can do is recognize a moment of readiness and act on it immediately. When you master emotional timing, your influence and connection with others will multiply exponentially. You'll find that people become more receptive to your ideas, more willing to share their authentic thoughts and feelings, and more appreciative of your consideration for their emotional state. This isn't manipulation. It's respect for the natural rhythms of human emotional experience. During my international training years, I had the privilege of working with students from 47 different countries, and this experience taught me that while core human emotions are universal, their expression varies dramatically across cultures and individuals. My photo albums from those sessions tell a fascinating story of how the same feeling can manifest in completely different ways depending on someone's background and personality. The first major lesson came when I was working with a group that included both American and Japanese executives. During a particularly challenging exercise about leadership failures, I noticed what appeared to be completely different emotional responses. The American participants showed their discomfort openly, shifting in seats, facial expressions of concern, some verbal expressions of anxiety. The Japanese participants remained still and composed, maintaining neutral expressions throughout. Initially, I assumed the Japanese executives were less engaged or perhaps not experiencing the same emotional impact, but during individual conversations afterward, I discovered that they had been feeling exactly the same emotions: anxiety, vulnerability, concern about appearing inadequate. Their cultural training had simply taught them to express these feelings differently through subtle changes in posture, breathing patterns, and the quality of their attention rather than through obvious facial expressions or body language. This revelation changed everything about how I read emotions in diverse groups. I realized I had been applying my own cultural lens to universal human experiences, potentially misreading entire populations of people based on my limited understanding of emotional expression. I began studying how different cultures handle specific emotions. Anger, for example, manifests very differently across cultural backgrounds. In some cultures, direct expression of anger is acceptable and healthy. Raised voices, animated gestures, and clear verbal confrontation are normal ways to address conflict. In others, anger goes underground, expressing itself through withdrawal, formal politeness that carries an edge, or indirect communication that requires careful interpretation. During one training session in New York, I worked with a woman from a Middle Eastern background who seemed perpetually agreeable and accommodating. Every suggestion was met with smiles and enthusiastic nodding. But I began noticing subtle inconsistencies, micro-expressions that didn't match her verbal agreement, slight delays before her enthusiastic responses, and energy that felt forced rather than authentic. Through patient conversation, I learned that her cultural upbringing had taught her that direct disagreement was disrespectful, especially with authority figures. She had been experiencing significant concern about several aspects of the training, but felt unable to express this directly. Once I understood her cultural communication style, I could read her real feelings through much more subtle cues and create space for her authentic input in culturally appropriate ways. But cultural differences extend beyond nationality or ethnicity. I discovered that professional cultures, regional backgrounds, generational differences, and even family cultures create distinct patterns of emotional expression. A person raised in a military family might express emotions very differently from someone raised in an artistic household, even if they're from the same geographic area. Individual personality differences proved equally important to understand. Some people are naturally more emotionally expressive. What they feel shows up immediately and obviously in their face, voice, and body language. Others are more emotionally contained. Their feelings are just as intense, but require more subtle observation to detect. I learned to establish what I call emotional baselines for individuals, understanding how each person typically expresses different emotions before trying to read variations in their patterns. Someone who is naturally reserved might show excitement through a slight increase in animation that would be imperceptible in a more expressive person. Conversely, someone who is typically very animated might signal distress through subtle decreases in their normal energy level. During my work with married couples, this principle proved crucial. Partners often misread each other because they expected their spouse to express emotions the same way they would. A naturally expressive person might interpret their reserved partner's quietness as rejection, when the partner was actually showing love through quality attention and presence, their natural style of emotional expression. I developed techniques for respectfully exploring individual emotional patterns without making assumptions. Instead of presuming I understood what someone's expressions meant, I would test my observations. I'm noticing that you seem more thoughtful than usual today. How are you feeling about what we've discussed? This approach allowed people to correct my interpretations while teaching me about their unique emotional language. The key insight I gained from this cross-cultural and individuals' work is that emotional reading must be adaptive and humble. While the core emotions, fear, anger, joy, sadness, are universal human experiences, the ways people express and process these emotions are incredibly diverse. Successful emotional reading requires what I came to call cultural emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize when your interpretation might be filtered through your own background rather than accurately reflecting someone else's experience. This means staying curious rather than assuming, asking respectful questions rather than jumping to conclusions, and remaining open to learning new emotional languages throughout your life. Most importantly, I learned that respect for individual and cultural differences in emotional expression actually deepens rather than complicates emotional reading. When you approach each person as having their own unique emotional signature that deserves to be understood on its own terms, you develop much more accurate and meaningful connections. The goal isn't to read everyone the same way, but to develop the flexibility and sensitivity to read each person in the way that honors their individual and cultural background, while still accessing the universal human emotions that connect us all. Of all the situations where emotional reading skills prove crucial, none is more important than during conflict. My mediation notes from union disputes, marriage counseling sessions, and corporate crises taught me that most conflicts escalate not because of the issues themselves, but because people misread the emotions driving the conflict. Learning to see beneath surface anger to the real feelings underneath has prevented countless destructive confrontations. My education in conflict emotions began during a particularly tense labor dispute at a steel plant where I was consulting. Management and union representatives sat across from each other radiating hostility, voices raised, accusations flying. On the surface, it appeared to be straightforward anger and opposition. But as I observed more carefully, I began to see something entirely different. The union leader's anger carried a particular quality that I recognized as hurt, masquerading as rage. His voice had an undertone of betrayal, and his eyes showed pain more than fury. When he accused management of not caring about worker safety, his vocal intensity increased, but his body language suggested vulnerability rather than aggression, slight, forward lean, hands open rather than clenched, seeking connection despite the harsh words. Similarly, the plant manager's defensive responses weren't driven by arrogance, as the union assumed, but by fear. I could see it in the tension around his eyes, the way his voice got higher when challenged, and his tendency to retreat into corporate policy language when pressed. He was terrified of being responsible for worker injuries and equally afraid of making decisions that might bankrupt the plant. Once I understood the real emotions driving the conflict, hurt and fear rather than simple anger, I could address what people were actually feeling instead of responding only to their surface behavior. The breakthrough came when I helped each side recognize and acknowledge the authentic emotions underneath their defensive positions. This experience taught me that anger is almost always a secondary emotion covering something more vulnerable. In conflict situations, I learned to look for what I call emotional archaeology, digging beneath the obvious emotions to find the primary feelings that are driving the destructive behavior. Fear shows up in conflict as rigid positions, refusal to consider alternatives, and escalating demands for guarantees or control. When someone becomes increasingly inflexible during a disagreement, they're usually afraid of something: loss of respect, financial security, relationship damage, or being proven wrong. Reading this underlying fear allows you to address the real issue rather than just the surface demands. Hurt often manifests as anger that has a particular emotional signature. Unlike anger born from frustration or injustice, hurt-based anger carries tones of betrayal and disappointment. The person's voice may be loud, but it also has a quality of pleading. Their accusations focus on relationship violations, trust broken, respect denied, feelings ignored, rather than just practical disagreements. During my marriage counseling work, I observed this pattern repeatedly. A wife would explode in anger about her husband's spending habits, but the real emotion was hurt that he made major financial decisions without consulting her. A husband would rage about his wife's career demands, but underneath was hurt that he felt displaced in her priorities. When couples learned to hear the hurt beneath the anger, they could respond with empathy rather than defensive counterattacks. I developed techniques for reading escalation triggers before conflicts exploded. There's usually a moment, sometimes lasting only seconds, when someone shifts from manageable frustration to destructive anger. Learning to catch this transition allows you to intervene before damage occurs. The signs include subtle changes in breathing pattern, slight alterations in voice quality, micro-expressions of contempt or disgust, and a body language that becomes more rigid. Most importantly, I learned to recognize when someone's emotional regulation was failing, when their capacity to control their reactions was being overwhelmed by the intensity of their feelings. One of the most valuable skills I developed was distinguishing between positional anger and personal anger. Positional anger focuses on issues, policies, or decisions. It's directed at situations rather than people. Personal anger attacks character, relationships, and identity. Positional anger can be productive and lead to solutions. Personal anger is almost always destructive and escalates conflicts rather than resolving them. Reading this difference allows you to respond appropriately. When someone is expressing positional anger, you can engage with their concerns and work towards solutions. When someone shifts to personal anger, the priority becomes de-escalation and protection of the relationship before addressing the underlying issues. I learned to identify what I call conflict fatigue, when people become emotionally exhausted from prolonged disagreement. This shows up as decreased animation, slower responses, and a general sense of resignation. People experiencing conflict fatigue often make poor decisions because they're desperate for resolution, even if it means accepting unfavorable terms. Recognizing this state allows you to suggest breaks or approach the situation differently. Perhaps, most importantly, I discovered how to read genuine readiness for resolution versus surface compliance. True readiness for resolution involves emotional shifts, decreased tension in voice and body, increased willingness to make eye contact, and a quality of presence that suggests authentic engagement rather than just going through the motions. The key to reading emotions in conflict is maintaining your own emotional regulation while staying curious about what's really driving other people's behavior. Instead of reacting to surface emotions, ask yourself what deeper feelings might be creating the anger, defensiveness, or resistance you're observing. Most conflicts are resolved not by addressing the stated positions, but by acknowledging and healing the underlying emotional wounds. When you can read and respond to the fear, hurt, or vulnerability beneath someone's aggressive behavior, you create the possibility for genuine resolution rather than temporary ceasefires. This approach transforms conflict from a battle to be won into an opportunity for deeper understanding and stronger relationships. The emotions that seem to divide people in conflict often become the bridge to connection once they're properly recognized and addressed. As I reflect on how communication has evolved since my early days of face-to-face interaction, I'm both amazed and concerned about how modern technology affects our ability to read emotions accurately. My collection of communication devices, from early telephone equipment to modern video conferencing tools, tells the story of humanity's remarkable ability to connect across distances, but also reveals what we lose when we rely too heavily on technological intermediaries. The telephone was my first encounter with emotionally limited communication. When I began conducting radio shows and telephone consultations, I had to learn entirely new skills for reading emotions through voice alone. Without visual cues, I became acutely sensitive to vocal patterns, breathing changes, and the subtle emotional undertones that most people miss during phone conversations. I discovered that telephone communication actually intensifies certain emotional signals while completely eliminating others. When you can't see someone's face or body language, you become more attuned to vocal variations, the slight tremor that reveals nervousness, the forced brightness that masks sadness, the careful control that suggests someone is editing their authentic responses. But I also learned the limitations. Some of my most profound misunderstandings occurred during telephone conversations, where I misread someone's emotional state because I was missing crucial visual information, a pause that I interpreted as thoughtful. Consideration was actually someone rolling their eyes in frustration. A calm voice that suggested acceptance was actually masking seething anger that was obvious in the person's body language. Video calling technology seemed to solve these problems. Initially, when video conferencing became available, I was excited about the possibility of combining visual and auditory emotional reading across distances. But I quickly discovered new challenges that most people don't consciously recognize, but definitely feel. The slight delay in video transmission creates emotional disconnection. When someone smiles in response to something you've said, but you see their smile a fraction of a second later than natural timing would dictate, your unconscious emotional reading system gets confused. The natural rhythm of emotional exchange, the micro-timing that allows us to feel truly connected, gets disrupted by technology. Camera angles and screen limitations further complicate emotional reading. You might see someone's face clearly, but miss crucial body language cues because they're sitting outside the camera frame. The forced direct eye contact of looking into a camera while trying to read emotions on a screen creates an artificial dynamic that our emotional reading systems aren't evolved to handle. Perhaps most significantly, I've observed how written communication, email, text messaging, social media, creates enormous potential for emotional misunderstanding. Without vocal tone, facial expressions, or body language, people are forced to interpret emotions through words alone, often projecting their own emotional state onto ambiguous messages. I've seen countless relationships damaged by email misunderstandings, where someone read anger into a message that was written with neutral intent, or where sarcasm was missed and statements were taken literally. The sender thinks they're communicating clearly, the receiver interprets the message through their own emotional filter, and conflict erupts from pure miscommunication. During my later consulting work, I developed strategies for improving emotional reading in technological communication. For phone conversations, I learned to create explicit emotional check-ins. I want to make sure I'm reading your reaction correctly. How are you feeling about this proposal? This direct approach compensates for missing visual information. For Video calls, I discovered the importance of establishing emotional baselines at the beginning of conversations. Since technology distorts our natural emotional reading ability, I would spend extra time observing someone's typical energy level, speaking patterns, and facial expressions during casual conversation before moving into important topics. The most challenging technological communication to navigate emotionally is written text. I developed practices for reading between the lines of emails and messages, looking for clues about emotional state, response time. Immediate responses often indicate strong emotional reactions. Word choice, formal language, when someone usually writes casually might indicate upset, and length, unusually brief responses can signal anger or withdrawal. But I also learned to be more explicit about my own emotional state in written communication. Instead of assuming my emotional tone would be correctly interpreted, I began including emotional context. I'm excited about this opportunity and want to make sure my enthusiasm comes through clearly, or I'm feeling concerned about this timeline, not critical of the work. One of the most important insights I gained is that technology requires us to work harder at emotional connection, not less. The ease of technological communication can create an illusion of connection while actually reducing emotional intimacy. Quick texts and emails can maintain contact while avoiding the deeper emotional engagement that builds strong relationships. I observed this particularly in workplace relationships. Teams that relied heavily on email and instant messaging often developed surface-level professional connections but struggled with trust, conflict resolution, and creative collaboration. The emotional nuances that build strong working relationships require richer communication channels than technology typically provides. The solution isn't to abandon technology, but to use it more consciously. Video calls for important emotional conversations rather than emails, phone calls when you need to hear someone's voice, face-to-face meetings when relationships need repair, or when dealing with complex emotional situations. And most importantly, I learned to recognize when technological communication was inadequate for the emotional complexity of a situation. If I found myself reading and rereading an email trying to understand someone's emotional state, that was a signal to pick up the phone or schedule an in-person conversation. Technology has given us unprecedented ability to stay connected across distances and time zones. But it has also created new challenges for emotional reading and human connection. The key is using technology as a tool to enhance human relationships rather than as a substitute for them, and developing new skills for reading emotions through technological filters, while recognizing when those filters are getting in the way of genuine understanding. For 30 years, I kept a daily practice journal documenting exercises and observations that sharpened my emotional perception skills. What I learned is that emotional reading isn't a talent you're born with or without. It's a skill that can be developed through conscious practice and patient observation. Let me share with you the specific techniques that transformed my ability to read people's emotions accurately. The foundation of emotional radar development is what I call emotional awareness meditation. Every morning, I would spend 10 minutes simply observing my own emotional state without trying to change it. I would notice physical sensations, energy levels, mood qualities, and how these internal experiences affected my perception of others. This self-awareness practice proved crucial because we can only read emotions in others to the degree that we understand them in ourselves. If you're not conscious of your own anxiety, you're unlikely to recognize it accurately in someone else. If you've never paid attention to how your own sadness manifests physically, you'll miss those same signals when they appear in others. I developed a specific exercise I called emotional snapshots. Throughout the day, I would take mental photographs of people's emotional expressions during different situations. Instead of just noticing that someone seemed upset, I would observe the specific details, exactly how their shoulders changed position, the precise quality of tension around their eyes, the particular way their voice altered. The key was specificity rather than general impressions. Instead of noting John seemed frustrated, I would record John's jaw tightened, his speech rate increased by about 20%, and his eye contact became more intense and sustained. This level of detailed observation trained my eye to catch subtle emotional shifts that most people miss entirely. One of the most powerful exercises I developed was what I called baseline establishment. For people I interacted with regularly, family members, colleagues, frequent clients, I would spend time observing their emotional patterns when they were in neutral, comfortable states. How did they typically stand when relaxed? What was their normal speaking pace and vocal tone? How did their facial expressions look during casual conversation? Establishing these baselines proved invaluable because emotional reading is largely about noticing deviations from normal patterns. A person who is typically very animated might signal distress through decreased energy that would seem normal in someone else. A naturally reserved person might show excitement through subtle increases in animation that would be invisible if you didn't know their baseline. I practiced what I called emotional triangulation, confirming my emotional readings through multiple channels before drawing conclusions. Instead of relying solely on facial expressions, I would check whether someone's body language, vocal tone, and energy level all told the same emotional story. When all channels aligned, I could feel confident in my reading. When they conflicted, I knew to investigate further. During my training sessions, I would conduct emotional experiments, deliberately observing how people responded to different types of content, questions, or activities. I noticed that certain topics consistently generated specific emotional responses, that particular types of challenges revealed authentic personality traits, and that people's reactions to stress or surprise were remarkably consistent once you learned their patterns. Perhaps the most important skill I developed was learning to separate my emotional projections from accurate emotional reading. We all tend to assume others feel the way we would feel in similar situations. Developing emotional radar requires constantly questioning these assumptions and staying curious about how someone else's emotional experience might differ from your own. I created exercises for improving emotional empathy, the ability to sense what someone else is feeling without losing awareness of your own emotional state. I would imagine myself in someone else's situation, try to feel what they might be experiencing, then check my accuracy through careful observation or direct inquiry. The practice of emotional inquiry became one of my most valuable tools. Instead of assuming I understood what someone was feeling, I would test my observations respectfully. You seem thoughtful about something. Am I reading that correctly? Or, I'm sensing some hesitation in your voice. Is there something about this plan that concerns you? This approach served multiple purposes. It improved my accuracy by allowing people to correct my misinterpretations. It demonstrated respect for their emotional experience. And it often opened doors to deeper conversations that strengthened our relationship. I developed specific exercises for reading group emotional dynamics. During meetings or social gatherings, I would practice scanning faces systematically, looking for emotional clustering, identifying the emotional influencers, and tracking how emotions spread through the group over time. One of the most challenging skills to develop was reading emotional authenticity, distinguishing between genuine and performed emotions. This required learning to recognize the subtle differences between emotions that arise naturally and those that are consciously constructed for social purposes. The key indicators I learned to watch for include microtiming. Authentic emotions have natural timing. Performed emotions often feel slightly off. Muscle tension patterns. Genuine emotions engage the entire face and body naturally. Performed emotions often show incongruent muscle tension. And energy quality. Authentic emotions have a particular aliveness. Performed emotions feel more controlled or hollow. I practiced reading emotional recovery patterns, how people naturally process and move through different emotional states. Some people need time and space to work through difficult emotions. Others process feelings through conversation and connection. Understanding these individual patterns helped me respond appropriately to people's emotional needs. Most importantly, I learned that building emotional radar requires patience and humility. You will make mistakes. You will misread situations. The goal isn't perfect accuracy, but continuous improvement and genuine respect for the complexity of human emotional experience. The daily practice that transformed my abilities most was simply paying conscious attention to emotions, my own and others, rather than taking them for granted. When you make emotional awareness a daily practice rather than an occasional observation, your sensitivity and accuracy will improve dramatically over time. Among my most treasured correspondence are the letters of apology I wrote when I misread someone's emotions and acted on those misreadings in ways that caused harm or misunderstanding. These letters taught me that emotional reading, no matter how skilled you become, is never infallible, and that intellectual humility is perhaps the most important quality for anyone seeking to understand others deeply. My most humbling mistake occurred during a corporate training session with a highly successful sales manager named Patricia. Throughout the morning, I observed what I interpreted as resistance and skepticism. Arms crossed, minimal eye contact, expressionless face during exercises that generated enthusiasm in others. I concluded she was opposed to the training and possibly undermining group engagement. During a break, I approached her privately to address what I perceived as her negative attitude. I suggested that her resistance was affecting the group dynamic and asked if there were concerns about the program that we should discuss. Her response shocked me completely. Patricia broke down, crying, explaining that she had just received devastating news about her mother's cancer diagnosis that morning. She was trying desperately to maintain professional composure while processing overwhelming grief and fear. What I had interpreted as resistance was actually enormous emotional effort to stay present despite personal crisis. I immediately wrote her a letter of apology, not just for my misinterpretation, but for approaching her with assumptions rather than curiosity. This experience taught me that emotional reading without compassionate inquiry can become emotional arrogance, believing we understand others better than they understand themselves. That incident led me to develop what I call the humble approach to emotional reading. Instead of acting on my interpretations as if they were facts, I learned to hold them as hypotheses to be tested gently and respectfully. The difference between "you seem resistant to this idea" and "I'm wondering how you're feeling about this" approach, "would you be willing to share your thoughts?" is the difference between presumption and invitation. I discovered that confirmation bias poses one of the greatest threats to accurate emotional reading. Once we form an impression of someone's emotional state or attitude, we tend to notice evidence that supports our initial interpretation while ignoring contradictory signals. This is particularly dangerous because it can create self-fulfilling prophecies where our expectations influence how others respond to us. During my marriage counseling work, I often saw couples trapped in cycles of emotional misreading, reinforced by confirmation bias. A husband would interpret his wife's quietness as rejection, then respond with withdrawal that actually created the rejection he feared. A wife would read her husband's focus on work as lack of caring, then respond with criticism that drove him further into work as an escape. Breaking these cycles required teaching people to question their emotional interpretations regularly and to seek feedback about their accuracy. I developed the practice of emotional hypothesis testing, explicitly checking interpretations before acting on them. Another crucial lesson came from recognizing the danger of emotional projection, assuming others feel the way we would feel in similar circumstances. During one training session, I was working with a participant who seemed anxious about an upcoming presentation. Based on my own experience with public speaking anxiety, I offered strategies for managing stage fright. Later, I learned that he wasn't anxious about speaking at all. He was excited and energized by the opportunity, but was naturally more reserved in his emotional expression. My assumption that his quiet preparation meant anxiety had led me to offer solutions for a problem that didn't exist, potentially creating anxiety where none had been present. This taught me to separate my emotional experience from my observations of others. Just because I would feel nervous in someone's situation doesn't mean they're feeling nervous. Just because silence would indicate upset in my communication style doesn't mean silence carries the same meaning for someone else. I learned to recognize the limitations of emotional reading across different contexts and relationships. Reading emotions accurately requires sufficient observation time, cultural understanding, and ideally some knowledge of someone's individual patterns. Trying to read complex emotions based on brief interactions or limited information often leads to significant errors. The most important skill I developed was the ability to hold multiple possible interpretations simultaneously rather than committing to a single reading. When I observed someone's emotional signals, I would consider several possible explanations. This could indicate frustration or concentration or fatigue or physical discomfort. This mental flexibility prevented me from jumping to conclusions and kept me curious about the person's actual experience. I also learned to pay attention to my own emotional state when reading others. When I was stressed, tired, or upset, my accuracy decreased significantly. My own emotions colored my interpretations of others' emotions, often in ways I didn't consciously recognize. Developing awareness of how my internal state affected my emotional reading ability became crucial for maintaining accuracy. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that admitting mistakes in emotional reading actually strengthened rather than weakened my relationships with others. When I acknowledged misreadings and apologized for acting on false assumptions, people felt seen and respected in ways that perfect accuracy never could have achieved. The humility to say, "I thought you were feeling X, but I was wrong. Can you help me understand what you were actually experiencing?" often opened doors to deeper conversations and greater trust than any demonstration of emotional reading skill ever could. This approach taught me that the goal of emotional reading isn't to be right about what others are feeling, but to create connection and understanding. Sometimes being wrong and handling that mistake with grace and curiosity accomplishes that goal better than being right ever could. The letters of apology in my files remind me that emotional reading is a tool for serving others, not for demonstrating my own perceptiveness. When that tool fails, as it inevitably will, the response should be humility, correction, and renewed commitment to understanding rather than defending my interpretations or pretending the mistake didn't happen. Throughout my years of consulting with executives and managers, I collected testimonials from leaders who transformed their effectiveness by mastering emotional reading skills. What I discovered is that true leadership isn't about having authority over others. It's about creating emotional environments where people feel safe, understood, and inspired to contribute their best work. The most profound leadership transformation I witnessed involved a manufacturing executive named Robert, who was struggling with what his board called people problems. His technical competence was unquestioned. His strategic thinking was excellent. But his teams consistently underperformed, and turnover in his department was the highest in the company. When I observed Robert in action, I immediately saw the disconnect. He was making decisions based solely on logical analysis while remaining completely blind to the emotional climate he was creating. During team meetings, he would present information efficiently, ask for questions, and when met with silence, assume everyone understood and agreed. What he didn't see was the body language that screamed discomfort, the crossed arms, the avoided eye contact, the subtle glances between team members that indicated disagreement or confusion. His efficient style was being interpreted as dismissive, and his silence about emotions was creating anxiety rather than clarity. I taught Robert to read the emotional temperature of his meetings by observing engagement levels, energy patterns, and group dynamics. Within weeks, he began noticing when his team was genuinely on board versus just politely compliant. He learned to recognize when someone had concerns they weren't voicing, and when his own communication style was creating resistance rather than understanding. The transformation was remarkable. Robert began responding to what his team was actually feeling, rather than just what they were saying. When he sensed confusion, he would slow down and check for understanding. When he noticed anxiety, he would address concerns proactively. When he saw genuine excitement, he would build on that energy rather than moving quickly to the next agenda item. His team's performance improved dramatically, not because he changed his strategic thinking, but because he learned to create psychological safety through emotional awareness. People began contributing ideas they had previously kept to themselves. Problems were identified and solved earlier because team members felt comfortable raising concerns. This experience taught me that emotional leadership begins with creating what I call emotional safety, an environment where people feel their emotions are acknowledged and respected, even when those emotions indicate disagreement or difficulty. I learned to recognize the difference between leaders who create emotional safety and those who create emotional suppression. Suppressive leaders respond only to words and logic, inadvertently punishing emotional expression through dismissal or discomfort. Safe leaders acknowledge the emotional component of every interaction and respond to both content and feeling during. My work with sales teams, I observed how emotionally aware leaders could gauge their team's psychological readiness for different types of challenges. A team that was feeling confident and energized could handle ambitious targets and complex strategies. A team that was dealing with recent failures or market pressures needed different approaches that rebuilt confidence before introducing new challenges. One sales director I worked with learned to read his team's collective emotional state during weekly meetings and adjust his leadership approach accordingly. When he sensed discouragement, he would focus on recent successes and smaller, achievable goals. When he detected overconfidence, he would introduce realistic challenges that kept the team grounded. When he noticed fatigue, he would address workload issues before they affected performance. This emotional attunement allowed him to provide exactly the type of leadership his team needed in each moment, rather than applying a one-size-fits-all approach regardless of emotional context. I discovered that emotionally intelligent leaders make fundamentally different decisions than those who focus only on logical factors. They consider not just what needs to be done, but how their team will emotionally respond to different approaches. They understand that the same message delivered with different emotional awareness can produce entirely different results. For example, delivering difficult feedback when someone is already feeling vulnerable and defensive will likely create resistance and resentment. The same feedback delivered when someone is feeling secure and open to growth can lead to positive change and increased trust. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that emotional leadership involves modeling emotional authenticity rather than emotional perfection. Leaders who try to present themselves as always confident and unaffected by challenges create distance rather than connection. Leaders who acknowledge their own emotional experiences while maintaining appropriate boundaries create environments where others feel permission to be human. I worked with one CEO who transformed her company culture by beginning meetings with brief emotional check-ins, not therapy sessions, but simple acknowledgments of how people were feeling about current challenges and opportunities. This practice created a level of authentic communication that improved problem-solving, innovation, and team cohesion dramatically. The key insight I gained is that emotional leadership isn't about being more emotional. It's about being more aware of emotions and more skilled at responding to them appropriately. This means recognizing when someone needs encouragement versus challenge, when a team needs direction versus autonomy, when a situation requires immediate action versus time for processing. Emotional leaders understand that every business decision has an emotional component. Every team dynamic is influenced by emotional undercurrents, and every individual's performance is affected by their emotional state. They use this understanding not to manipulate, but to create conditions where people can do their best work. The testimonials in my files describe leaders who increased team performance, reduced turnover, improved innovation, and built stronger customer relationships, not through new strategies or systems, but through developing emotional awareness and using it to create more effective human connections. True leadership happens when people choose to follow you, not just because of your position, but because they feel understood, valued, and inspired by their interactions with you. This kind of followership can only be earned through emotional intelligence and the practical wisdom to apply it skillfully in service of others. Among my most treasured possessions are the before and after stories from couples, families, and friends who transformed their relationships by learning to read and respond to each other's emotions accurately. These documented cases prove that emotional understanding isn't just a nice idea. It's a practical skill that can save marriages, heal family wounds, and create lasting intimacy between people who care about each other. The most dramatic transformation I witnessed involved a couple named Margaret and James, who came to me on the verge of divorce after 15 years of marriage. They described their relationship as polite but distant, claiming they never fought but also never felt truly connected. Both insisted they still loved each other but had grown apart in ways they couldn't explain or repair. During our first session together, I observed their interaction patterns carefully. They were unfailingly courteous to each other, but I noticed something troubling. They weren't actually seeing each other emotionally. Margaret would speak about feeling overwhelmed with work and household responsibilities, while James nodded politely and offered logical solutions. James would mention feeling unappreciated for his efforts to provide for the family, while Margaret acknowledged his hard work, but missed the emotional need underneath his words. They were having parallel conversations rather than connected ones. Each person was expressing their emotional needs, but neither was reading or responding to their partner's actual feelings. They had developed a pattern of surface-level communication that maintained peace but prevented intimacy. I taught them to start reading each other's emotional subtexts rather than just listening to words. Margaret learned to hear the longing for appreciation beneath James's factual reports about his work achievements. James learned to see the exhaustion and desire for partnership behind Margaret's practical discussions about household tasks. The breakthrough came when Margaret said something about being tired, and instead of offering to help with specific tasks, his usual logical response, James responded to her emotional state. "You sound exhausted, and I imagine you're feeling pretty alone in managing everything. That must be really hard." For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly seen and understood. Similarly, when James mentioned a success at work, instead of giving perfunctory congratulations, Margaret responded to his emotional need. "You've been working so hard on that project. It must feel really good to have your efforts recognized." James later told me it was the first time in months he had felt emotionally connected to his wife. This shift from logical responses to emotional responses transformed their entire relationship dynamic. They began having conversations about feelings rather than just facts. They started noticing and responding to each other's emotional needs rather than just practical requests. Most importantly, they developed genuine curiosity about each other's inner experience rather than making assumptions about what their partner needed. Another powerful transformation involved a father and his teenage daughter who had been locked in constant conflict for over a year. David described his daughter Sarah as angry, disrespectful, and increasingly distant. Sarah saw her father as controlling and unsympathetic to her growing independence needs. When I observed their interactions, I saw two people who loved each other deeply, but were completely misreading each other's emotions. David was interpreting Sarah's attempts at independence as rejection and disrespect, responding with increased control that felt like oppression to her. Sarah was expressing her normal developmental needs for autonomy through behaviors that triggered David's fear of losing his relationship with his daughter. I taught David to read Sarah's emotional needs beneath her rebellious behavior. Her desire to make her own decisions wasn't rejection of his love. It was a natural part of growing up. Her frustration with his rules wasn't disrespect. It was her way of testing boundaries and developing her own identity. Similarly, I helped Sarah understand that her father's protective instincts came from love, not from desire to control her life. His concerns about her choices reflected his emotional investment in her well-being, not lack of trust in her judgment. Once they could read each other's authentic emotions instead of reacting to surface behaviors, their relationship began healing. David learned to respond to Sarah's need for independence with support rather than resistance. Sarah learned to appreciate her father's love even when she disagreed with his guidance. These relationship transformations taught me that most relationship problems aren't caused by incompatibility or lack of love. They're caused by emotional misunderstanding. People hurt each other not because they don't care, but because they misread emotional signals and respond to their interpretations rather than to authentic feelings. I discovered that emotional understanding creates what I call a positive feedback loop in relationships. When someone feels truly seen and understood, they naturally become more open and emotionally available. This increased openness makes them easier to read and understand, which strengthens the connection further. Conversely, emotional misunderstanding creates negative feedback loops. When someone feels misunderstood, they become more defensive and less emotionally available. This makes them harder to read accurately, leading to more misunderstandings and greater distance. The key to breaking negative cycles and creating positive ones is learning to respond to emotions rather than just to words or behaviors. This means developing the skill to ask yourself, what might this person be feeling right now, and how can I respond to that feeling in a way that creates connection rather than distance? I learned that small changes in emotional responsiveness often create dramatic improvements in relationship quality. A husband who learns to recognize when his wife needs emotional support rather than practical advice. A parent who can see the hurt beneath their child's angry outburst. A friend who notices when someone needs encouragement rather than suggestions. Perhaps most importantly, these relationship transformations taught me that emotional understanding must be mutual to be truly effective. One person learning to read emotions better helps, but both people learning to see and respond to each other's emotional needs creates the kind of deep intimacy and connection that sustains relationships through all of life's challenges. The stories in my files describe relationships that moved from superficial politeness to genuine intimacy, from chronic conflict to collaborative problem solving, from emotional distance to deep connection. None of these transformations required changing who people were. They only required learning to see and respond to who people actually are beneath the surface of their words and behaviors. As I write what may be my final thoughts on the art of reading human emotions, I want to share with you a letter I have prepared for future generations, a message about the profound responsibility and extraordinary opportunity that comes with truly seeing and understanding others. The skills I've taught you throughout this journey aren't just techniques for better communication. They're tools for building a more emotionally connected and compassionate world. Let me tell you about the compound effect of emotional intelligence that I've witnessed over my lifetime. When one person in a family, workplace, or community develops the ability to read and respond to emotions skillfully, the impact ripples outward in ways that continue long after that person is gone. I think of Margaret, the executive who learned to create psychological safety in her team meetings. Her emotional awareness didn't just improve her department's performance. It taught dozens of people what it felt like to be truly heard and understood in a professional setting. Those people carried that experience into their own leadership roles, creating emotionally intelligent environments for hundreds of others. The ripple effect of her learning continues to spread decades later. I remember Thomas, the father who learned to read his son's emotional needs beneath rebellious behavior. Their improved relationship not only healed their family dynamic, it showed his son what emotional attunement looked like, shaping how that young man would eventually relate to his own children. 3 generations of improved emotional connection grew from one person's commitment to understanding rather than judging. These stories illustrate what I've come to understand as the most important truth about emotional intelligence. Your ability to read and respond to emotions appropriately doesn't just improve your own relationships, it teaches everyone around you what genuine understanding feels like and gives them a model for creating that understanding in their own lives. Every time you respond to someone's authentic emotions rather than just their words, you're demonstrating a different way of being human. Every time you choose curiosity over assumption, empathy over judgment, understanding over reaction, you're contributing to a cultural shift toward greater emotional intelligence and connection. But this legacy comes with profound responsibility. The skills I've shared with you can be used to manipulate and control others just as easily as they can be used to serve and understand them. The ability to read emotions accurately gives you power in every relationship and interaction. How you use that power determines whether you contribute to healing or harm in the world. I've seen people use emotional reading skills to identify vulnerabilities they could exploit, to manipulate others into decisions that served selfish interests, to gain unfair advantages in negotiations or relationships. This application of emotional intelligence creates more disconnection and distrust, not less. The ethical use of emotional reading always serves the other person's authentic needs, not just your own agenda. It seeks to understand in order to connect and support, not to control or manipulate. It honors the emotional truth you perceive rather than using it for personal gain. Throughout my life, I've been motivated by a vision of what human relationships could become if more people developed genuine emotional intelligence. Imagine workplaces where people felt truly understood and valued for their authentic contributions. Imagine families where every member felt seen and appreciated for who they really are. Imagine communities where conflicts were resolved through understanding rather than power struggles. This vision isn't utopian fantasy. It's achievable through the practical application of the skills I've shared with you. Every person who learns to read emotions accurately and respond with empathy and wisdom moves us closer to this more connected world. Want to challenge you personally with a 30-day commitment that could transform not just your own relationships, but your contribution to the emotional intelligence of everyone around you. For the next 30 days, commit to reading and responding to at least one person's authentic emotions every single day, not their words, not their surface behavior, but their genuine emotional experience. Notice when someone needs encouragement, understanding, space, or connection, and respond to that need appropriately. Pay attention to the ripple effects. Notice how people respond when they feel truly seen and understood. Observe how your emotional awareness affects the atmosphere in your workplace, family, and social circles. Watch for opportunities to model emotional intelligence in situations where others might respond with reaction or judgment. Keep a daily record of these interactions and their outcomes. I predict you'll be amazed at how much your relationships improve and how differently people begin responding to you when you consistently demonstrate genuine emotional understanding. But don't stop with 30 days. Make emotional awareness and skillful response a lifelong practice. Continue developing your ability to see beneath the surface of human interaction to the authentic emotional experience that drives all behavior. Teach these skills to others, not through lectures or advice, but through your example. Show your children, colleagues, friends, and family members what it looks like to respond to emotions with wisdom and compassion. Let them experience what it feels like to be truly understood, and they'll naturally begin extending that same understanding to others. The world desperately needs more people who can see beyond surface behavior to the human heart underneath. It needs individuals who respond to fear with reassurance, to anger with curiosity about the hurt beneath it, to withdrawal with gentle invitation to connection. You now possess skills that most people never develop. You understand principles of human emotion that can transform every relationship in your life. More importantly, you have the opportunity to contribute to a cultural shift toward greater emotional intelligence and genuine human connection. The choice is yours. You can use these skills for personal advantage, or you can use them in service of creating the kind of world where every person feels truly seen, understood, and valued for who they really are. My deepest hope is that the emotional intelligence you've developed will become part of your legacy, a gift you give not only to those you interact with directly, but to all the people whose lives will be touched by the ripple effects of your wisdom, compassion, and genuine understanding of the beautiful complexity of human emotion. The secret to reading people's emotions isn't really about reading at all. It's about loving people enough to see them clearly and respond to what they truly need. Master this art, and you'll discover that the greatest reward isn't what you gain from understanding others, but what you give to the world through that understanding.